Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Global Power Dynamics. In today's conversation with my guest, we will explore the rising tensions and strategic calculations among the Northeast Asian countries, including of the United States, like Taiwan, Japan, and Beijing. What's going on in this world's most critical region? Taiwan, as many of has long been at the center of strategic calculations among great powers and regional powers. From its very beginning, the island has been a critical factor in regional and global power competitions. Most recently, there is a great move coming from Japan. Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi stated that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be an existential threat to Tokyo. At the same time, just yesterday, we see that United States approved a record 11.1 billion arms package for Taiwan, prompting a harsh response from Beijing. To unpack all these questions, today I'm joined by my guest, Michael Cunningham. He's a political analyst specializing in China and Northeast Asia with a master's degree in international affairs and rich experience in both government and private sectors. He's an experienced researcher, a public speaker, and project manager. Michael is also excellent oral and writing communication with near native fluency in Chinese Mandarin language. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Michael, let's start with the recent move coming from Japan. Why is Taiwan so important for Japan's security, overall security of Japan?
Yeah, so, first of all, Japan depends on the sea lanes around Taiwan for almost all of its energy imports, for much of its trade in general, including its exports. If China controlled Taiwan, it would probably allow trade to continue almost under all circumstances, but it could cut it off in wartime, or to force Tokyo's hand at any time. So this is huge leverage that Japan cannot allow China to have. Certainly, Japan's survival would, to an extent, if Taiwan were truly in Beijing's hands, under Beijing's control, it would, to an extent, depend on Beijing's goodwill. So if China controlled Taiwan, when Prime Minister Takaichi said it would be a war, a contingency would be a survival-threatening situation. That is absolutely true, and it would be survival-threatening for Japan if Taiwan controlled, or if China controlled Taiwan. The U.S. would also probably be incapable of fulfilling its security obligation to Japan under those circumstances. China would be able to break through the first island chain if it controlled Taiwan, which is really a critical node in that chain. It would be able to operate more freely in the Pacific and harass Japan from multiple angles. Not that it would under most circumstances, but it would be able to, and that is a huge security threat that no country is going to allow, especially its greatest regional rival to have. So I guess I would also point out that Japan is the closest country to the main island of Taiwan. Most people don't understand that. They think that, well, Taiwan is, not far from mainland China, and that's true. But Japan's Yonaguni Island is literally 100 kilometers away, the closest land to the main island of Taiwan. If any war occurred over Taiwan, it would directly affect Japan, regardless of whether Japan wanted to be involved or not.
So, from your point of view, what was the strategic intent behind the Sanae Takaichi's remarks, and why did China respond so forcefully?
Yeah, well, I certainly don't think that the remark, what she said was driven by some kind of strategic plan. I think, she was put on the spot, she was asked a question, and she gave an honest answer that the vast majority of people in Japan, I think, would agree with. She I don't think she wanted the attention or the diplomatic backlash that she got, although it hasn't hurt her popularity. It has only helped her, but I don't think she wanted that. I don't think she wanted right off the bat to be dealing with such a diplomatic crisis. But, what was said, what's done is done. And I think it's probably in Japan's long-term interest that she said that. So when you talk about the strategic rationale behind it, there is some pretty clear rationale. It's tensions with China are going to surge over one issue or another from time to time. That's just the nature of their relationship. The only way to stop that would be for Japan to really stop caring about its own security interests and let China basically do whatever it wants. And that's partly because of historical grievances, but partly it's just it's part of the regional structure. These are the two, with the exception of the US, these are the two strongest East Asian countries, and they have a history of butting heads. Now, of course, Japan cannot accept that, and so from that perspective, it makes sense. But I think the more important thing from Japan's perspective is, sure, by what she said, they really ticked off Beijing, and it caused a reaction. But that eventually is going to blow over. But Japan has a more serious problem where U.S. support for Taiwan in some political circles, not the mainstream. The U.S. remains Taiwan's greatest supporter globally, but in some political circles in the U.S., support for Taiwan is starting to decline, and people are starting to question, is Taiwan really in our interest? And much of this is based on the assumption that China is going to attack Taiwan at some point, possibly in the near future, and that the U.S. would be all alone, that the U.S. would have to twist Japan's arm. This is a very, very widely held assumption that Japan would want to stay out of it, and the U.S. would have to twist Japan's arm to even let us use U.S. military bases in Japan. Whereas from Japan's perspective, it has always been, look, we're not going to say this because we don't want to deal with the diplomatic fallout, but we would be the ones twisting America's arm to get involved because this is an existential issue for us. And so really at this point, the US needed to hear this, and Japan needed the US to hear this. So, the diplomatic crisis is going to eventually blow over, but I don't think, I think Japan does see it, since they're already dealing with this crisis, may as well wait it out, and the message has been sent to Washington.
Looking from Beijing, do you think these comments cross the Beijing's lines, or just Beijing using this for a broader signaling?
Yeah, I mean, clearly didn't cross Beijing's red line. It came nowhere close to bringing about Taiwan independence. Doesn't even go in that direction, really. And so that is Beijing's red line. It's still, I guess it brought Japan closer to US-style strategic ambiguity, but still far from the kind of support. I mean, you just mentioned the largest arms sale ever from the US. Japan isn't doing anything like that for Taiwan. So, objectively, she did stay very far from China's red line. If she had crossed a red line, China would have used force. And this is where I really sort of get frustrated or concerned about the tendency of both China and the US to throw around the term red line. I find it quite dangerous. We've seen the US do that. Obama very famously saying that the use of chemical weapons in Syria would be crossing a red line. And then when it was crossed,
Michael, from here, what kind of comparison can we make between Takaichi's remarks and Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan?
Yeah, so Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, I think, was much more it was something much more substantive. It wasn't unprecedented.
It was kind of the red line for Beijing, I think.
Well, but at the same time, it wasn't. So, it was definitely something Beijing cared more about, because it hadn't happened since I believe it was the 90s, the last time a U.S. House Speaker had visited Taiwan, but it had happened before. So, that falls under the category of things that the U.S. hasn't really done in recent decades because it's been afraid of coming anywhere close to China's red lines, whereas, and because it was so focused on the cooperative business relationship with the U.S. and China. But as U.S. views towards China have changed, and U.S. concerns about the Taiwan Strait issue have also become more intense, Taiwan has turned more into sort of a card that U.S. politicians like to play, because they're showing that they're tough on China. That it has become something that once again was on the agenda. Now we saw very different responses from Beijing to Speaker Pelosi's visit than we saw to Takaichi's comments. And I think part of that is that, Takaichi didn't say anything that Beijing doesn't already know. Now, they are legitimately concerned about Japan's gradual remilitarization, which it has to do because the threat from China, China's own military development has been so rapid and so shocking. As China is more active, Japan does have to take its security seriously, but at the same time, she didn't say anything new that Beijing doesn't already know, and yes, Beijing is concerned about that, and they're really playing it up both because they're concerned and frankly for domestic reasons as well. This made really big news, and they definitely have interest in showing their people that they're tough, that they're standing up for China, and also on upplaying this issue in case things ever go really south with Japan. They've done their homework now that they can show, look, this has all been Tokyo's fault, not, that's the message Beijing wants to show. Yeah, that's so just to answer your, I don't think I don't think that was crossing a red line.
Yeah, so from now on, what will be the realistic path forward for Beijing and Tokyo's relations?
Well, I think it's going to remain tense for some time. We could see, potentially several months of tension. I guess I neglected to mention that by clearly spelling out that it would be that a Taiwan contingency would be an existential threat for Japan. That is something that hasn't been clearly spelled out by a sitting Japanese prime minister yet, and it is quite significant because based on Japan's national security laws, Japan would be able to get involved in a Taiwan conflict if it is understood to be a survival threatening situation. And so that's another reason why China is so concerned and why this isn't likely to just blow over rapidly, but it will eventually. China is going to continue trying to get Takaichi to retract her statement. She's not going to do that. It would not be in Japan's interest to do that now and then have to wade into these waters again in the future, when they actually do have to once again reiterate how important Taiwan is. So I think they're going to sit this out, and Japan is really trying to not play ball too much with Beijing, not really contribute too much to the escalating tensions, but trying to dial it down, and eventually the news cycle is going to overcome this, or both sides are going to have some kind of a development where they're able to gradually lay their tensions aside, and that's how it's happened historically between Japan and China, between Japan and South Korea, between most countries that end up with these diplomatic crises.
United States is the number one actors in this triangle between Japan, Taiwan, and Beijing. So why does the Taiwan matter so much for United States security, economy, and technological prosperity?
Yeah, thanks for this question. This is something that is hotly being debated in the U.S. right now, and it is a debate that was settled back basically when the Korean War broke out, but we're in a different day today, and there's really a generational shift in U.S. policymakers and a very different world that we're living in. And so there are a lot of questions like that in the U.S. And so this is a super important question, and framing it in terms of national interest doesn't really work these days. And so let me sort of dig into some of the specific ways Taiwan is so important to the U.S. First of all, economics. It's not just semiconductors. Taiwan is at the center of global trade. About 90% of the biggest container ships transit the Taiwan Strait. Countries around the world rely on the waters around Taiwan for trade. It's not just Japan. Projections have shown that a war over Taiwan would probably erase at least 10% of the global GDP. That means a global economic depression, a depression with a D. These are also, most of the studies say that these are conservative figures. And why is this? Well, one reason is Taiwan is at the center of global manufacturing. What we know today is, everything's made in China. Some of that's moving to India, Vietnam, other places. But what people don't think about is, yes, it's being made in China with components from all over the world, including some critical components from Taiwan. But most critically, it's being made in China by Taiwanese companies. Taiwan is really at the center of global manufacturing. Also, I mentioned many parts coming from Taiwan. Taiwan has what are called hidden champions. And these are small businesses, tiny, in many cases, family-owned businesses that produce one or two components that businesses throughout the world rely on. And these happen to be the top producers of just a couple components. And companies throughout the world are relying on them for their manufacturing as well. I'll give you just one example: screws, fasteners. It sounds cheap, it sounds boring, and frankly it is. But we're not talking cheap little screws that anyone can produce. We're talking in many cases high performance fasteners for the aerospace industry. You don't want to just put anything in an airplane and risk that it's going to fall apart midair. Taiwan is one of the top producers of these. And US manufacturers this year have already experienced shortages in screws because of tariffs that have disrupted the supply from Taiwan. And so that's just one small, boring example of this much bigger picture. Now, I guess more importantly, security. We talked about how Taiwan is a critical node in the first island chain. If China were to attack Taiwan, the U.S. would almost certainly be pulled in because it would threaten Japan's survival. It would threaten the Philippines' survival. These are both treaty allies of the U.S. Now, some new political forces in the U.S. might say, well, maybe it's time to do away with that. And to that, I'd say, a war with China would be even more likely if China controlled Taiwan. And this isn't, I don't think this is threat escalation, or, you know, I don't think I'm exaggerating anything by saying that. China has been very clear that it wants the US military out of Asia. It does want to call the shots and have regional dominance in Asia. Other countries in Asia are not so excited about that. Japan, Korea, even to an extent, you know, neighboring countries. I don't think Russia would be thrilled about it. I don't think India would be thrilled about it, even though they're not directly in East Asia. So China is really surrounded by powerful countries that it would have to deal with to achieve regional supremacy. And so, you know, if the U.S. abandoned, or, you know, if not if the U.S. abandoned Taiwan, I mean, Taiwan still wouldn't necessarily become taken over by China. But if China did manage to get a hold of Taiwan and push the U.S. out of Asia gradually, and it would work to do that, which would also increase the likelihood of conflict. Well, then, you know, we just have to remember World War II. And it's not that China would immediately or necessarily at any point attack the US, but it would have much more capability to do so. US territories in the Pacific, like Guam, would be directly threatened. Even potentially Hawaii, as we learned in World War II, when Japan had control of the Pacific. Even the U.S. mainland. And so currently the U.S. has China surrounded. It's not fair to China, but, you know, I don't think the U.S. or any of its allies would say we want to change that. You know, it's just it's the nature of the power dynamic, and you know, we don't ever want to have a war with China. But in the worst case scenario that it does break out, I'd much rather have it break out over there than close to the US's own shores.
How are the attitudes in United States toward Taiwan changing in US political circles, especially? What's driving these shifts?
Yeah, so there are shifts happening, and what's driving them is the widely held belief that China is going to use military force to resolve the Taiwan issue, and that it could do so very soon. So what are some of these changes? Well, both parties in the U.S., and this is a very mainstream change, both parties are actively, to say it in very stark terms, actively trying to degrade Taiwan's strategic position. Now, that's obviously not to harm Taiwan, but that's because they feel that, for example, semiconductors being largely manufactured in Taiwan is a threat to the US because they believe Taiwan is about to be at war. So that's one of these areas, and that, as I said, is mainstream. Almost universally in the US, it is believed that the fact that we rely on Taiwan for certain things, including semiconductors, that we need to change that, and as fast as possible. So that's one way things are changing. Now, another way is there are some fringe views that are gaining popularity and becoming less fringe. And I don't want to sound alarmist by bringing these up, because, as I said, neither of them are close to being mainstream right now, but they are gaining in popularity. And one of these views is that the only way to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is to show China real strength by forming full diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So flip-flopping and going back to recognition of Taiwan, or entering a security agreement with Taiwan. Now, of course, for those of us who know Beijing's red lines and Beijing's positions on this issue, that would almost certainly cause the war that these people think they'd be deterring. And so that's actually a quite concerning narrative. Now, there's another narrative equally concerning, where people, especially some new right figures in the U.S., not all, but some, they feel that China is definitely going to attack Taiwan. It's only a matter of time, and what that logically means for if you actually believe that, is that, well, if the U.S. continues to support Taiwan, and if there's nothing we can do to stop the invasion that is definitely coming, in their opinion, then continuing to support Taiwan means we're going to get dragged into a war with China, and who wants that? So this, according to this view, is the U.S. needs to cut its losses and let China do as it pleases in the region. Now, that's a very dangerous line of thought for the reasons that I just explained, but and I just want to reemphasize again, it's definitely not a mainstream view, but there are some people in powerful positions that have views similar to that.
And Michael, there is another point about the U.S. pressure on Taiwan to increase its defense budget, even sometimes for 5 to 10%. This is a huge amount for a small country like Taiwan. So how we should understand this position? Is just belong to one administration, or this is a call for all U.S. allies, or just specifically for Taiwan? How should we understand?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think 5 to 10%, this figure is specifically for Taiwan. For most U.S. allies, I think, 3%, 3.5%, something like that. This is, once again, this has been being driven by the view that war is imminent, and that Taiwan really needs to get its act together and take its own security seriously. I hear people say, we can't care about Taiwan's defense more than Taiwan cares about its defense. Now, I would say this is a misleading narrative. Most in Taiwan would agree that defense spending needs to increase, and it needs to be used in smarter ways. They would agree with this. And I would point out all 3 major political parties in Taiwan would agree with this, including their chairpersons. They would all agree with this. In fact, they all do agree with this. Now, I would point out Taiwan has consistently had high, above 2% defense spending. It's been higher than many U.S. allies, but certainly not sufficient for the threat it faces. So what's going on? Well, Taiwan already spends more as a percentage of its total government budget than the U.S. does. So here's where the problem is. The U.S. spends about 13%, I believe, is the figure of its budget on defense. So looking at budget, not percent of GDP. In Taiwan, that's officially around 15%, but my contacts in Taiwan say it's closer to 20, because that percentage, that 15, doesn't include special budgets that have been passed later. So here's where the sort of the discrepancy comes from. Government spending and total government spending in Taiwan for all things is only about 13% of Taiwan's GDP. That means that if Taiwan were to spend 5% of its GDP on defense, that would be over a third of their budget. If they were to spend 10%, that's over 3/4 of their budget. Now, how would they be able to do that? By cutting spending in other critical areas: emergency services, critical infrastructure, social safety net, national health insurance. This is the classic guns versus butter issue. But in Taiwan, this is a very serious political issue. So Taiwan really needs both to function and to maintain its security, and for its government to have credibility. You've got government spending on the social and economic issues. You're going to stoke unrest, discredit their government, make unification look not so bad to a lot of people in Taiwan. At least they can afford to live and have the basic social services they need. So this is a serious issue. and it's to act too aggressively on spending and change things too much would really play into Beijing's hands. So what can they do about this, right? Well, clearly they need a bigger government budget, but that's easier said than done. Low taxes are key to their economic model. They encourage investment, they encourage consumer spending. Taxes are rising in Taiwan, but there's a limit to how high they can go and how fast you can increase the tax rate. Before you start to have the opposite effect of what you're trying to accomplish, and before you really cause more social problems than it's worth. So the other, I guess, possibility is take out a bunch of debt to finance a much higher budget. But there's also a limit to how Taiwan can do this. Remember, Taiwan has a really ambiguous international status. It's not a member of the IMF. It can't rely on a bailout if excessive borrowing results in a financial crisis or in currency instability. Now, I say it can't rely on a bailout. It really can. You can count on the fact that Beijing would be there willing to bail it out, but that would come with at very high cost, the cost of Taiwan's sovereignty. So these economic issues for Taiwan are national security issues. There's a really delicate trade-off that they have to do. And this is really, all major parties in Taiwan are really trying to find the right balance here. And it's very difficult with social pressures and pressures from the US, and then just, the pressure from Beijing. And so it's much more complex than the, why can't they get their act together and just put 10% of their GDP towards defense type of narrative.
And I think beyond the security issues with China, there is a significant amount of trade between Taiwan and mainland, and this makes Taiwan dependent on China.
Yeah, there's dependency goes both ways though as well, and Taiwan has been pretty impressively decoupling or de-risking from China in many ways. But there's also a delicate balance here. So, one side of the equation is Taiwanese companies rely too much on China. So much of their manufacturing happens in China. So much of their trade is with China. And so much of their investment used to go to China. Now that's no longer the case. But the other side of the equation is entire regions of China are currently reliant on Taiwanese manufacturing firms for almost all of their private sector employment. Now, this is a huge risk, not just economic risk, but a huge political risk to China as well. So the dependency and the leverage really goes both ways. And it would be fascinating to really do an in-depth study of who has the greater leverage in some of these questions.
It's a really interesting point. And just come back to the security issues. There is another debate also in Taiwan. So what do the Taiwan's internal political divisions and resistance to higher defense spending mean for its overall security posture?
Yeah, so this really relates to the whole guns versus butter and defense spending issue I was just talking about. I would just point out that, again, all the parties in Taiwan are dedicated to Taiwan's defense, but they need to stop putting politics ahead of national defense. All of them are guilty of this. There's a tendency, and the media do a good job of really promoting this view in many ways that that the DPP is serious about defense and the KMT is pro-Beijing, which is not true. They're all very serious and want to increase defense spending. The KMT, so where the debates happen, is the KMT wants to make sure there's transparency, that money is being used in the right way, and that they find the right balance. And they do sort of, have a different view of where that balance is. And this is a legitimate debate. where, you know, they might not think that the percentage that's spent on defense has to be as high as the GDP might think, but they still do advocate for increasing defense spending to over 3% as quickly as possible. But you know, it's the KMT is terrible at playing politics. It's so easy for the DPP to, you know, submit like a 4-page funding request to the legislature, and then the KMT is like, "Oh, there are no details here. Come on, we're not going to write a blank check. What's going on?" And then it's so easy then for the KMT to look like they don't care about defense, and they fall into this trap every time. And the DPP plays it so brilliantly every time. And I don't mean this as a criticism of the DPP or of the KMT, but this is just, you know, much of it is being driven by domestic politics, and it's not that either side is like a Trojan horse of the CCP or anything like that.
Mike, what are the implications of U.S. efforts to relocate semiconductors product away from Taiwan, both for Washington and for Taipei? Because the semiconductor becomes almost equal with the security in discussions.
Yeah, that's right. So this is, I sort of alluded to this in a previous question. I don't doubt that it's well-intentioned what the U.S. is trying to do. You know, the U.S. government should be looking out for U.S. interests above all. And certainly the America First government recognizes this. And so it's not a surprise that they're trying to do this. But we also have to remember Biden was also he was using different methods. He was also trying to move Taiwan semiconductor production to the United States. So for Taipei, what does this mean? Well, there's a lot of debate about whether Taiwan really has a silicon shield. And I would say we need to stop looking at questions in binary terms, that either it's invincible or it has no shield. Taiwan clearly has a silicon shield. Much of the world depends on Taiwan. Beijing depends on Taiwan in many ways. And so this is a shield, but just like a shield, you know, if you're holding a shield and you're in a sword fight, it's not necessarily, it doesn't make you invincible. And especially if someone launches a ballistic missile at you, that little shield isn't going to help you, right? And so no one ever said that a shield makes you invincible, but Taipei does have a silicon shield, and it can't afford to lose that. It may be weakening, but it still is a shield. Now, at the same time, TSMC is being forced to make what really is a bad investment. Morris Chang had very famously said that it costs TSMC about 50% more to produce semiconductors in the US as opposed to in Taiwan, let alone they just do not have the industry cluster in the US. US officials can tout investment of a couple firms in Arizona near the TSMC plant and say, oh, now we have an industry cluster. But it's not. Taiwan has an industry cluster. It's massive. It's much of the island. And so, you know, if all of America's chips were produced in the US, or if, you know, the bulk of them were produced here, we would have much higher costs that US manufacturers would have to absorb, and probably US consumers, and also lower quality of the chips, probably just because Taiwan is so good at it. They're so practiced with it. They have it down to a science. And so, you know, I would argue that it's bad for US reindustrialization. If the US starts massively manufacturing its own products in the US, well, I think there's going to be a clear market for more semiconductor production and more production of other critical components in the United States. Now, I would say one other thing: semiconductor production relies on inputs from multiple countries. disruption anywhere in any of these countries would probably halt production. And I would be more worried about China, for example, cutting off the supply of rare earths that go into the semiconductors Taiwan makes. It certainly won't do that now, but if China becomes less reliant on semiconductors from the rest of the world, I don't see why it wouldn't do that if it felt it needed to squeeze Taiwan. So I guess the last thing I'd say about this is the U.S. and Taiwan really have perfect cooperation in semiconductors, a really good division of labor. The U.S. designs the chips, Taiwan manufactures them. If we can keep this cooperation, I think it's very hard for China to catch up. The Chinese government is really pouring a lot of resources into, in the way of investment and subsidies and whatnot, into multiple nodes of the semiconductor industry where both the US and Taiwan are able to specialize. And I think this is a winning formula. The risk of conflict, yeah, the US needs to increase its own semiconductor production, but I don't think I don't think a large scale movement of semiconductor manufacturing from Taiwan to the US is really called for strategically.
And Michael, when we discussing about the relocation, even it is not the realistic in the foreseeable future or not happened in foreseeable future, will there be any alternative destinations beyond the US, such as Southeast Asian countries or Korea or Vietnam, like some other US companies like Apple moving from Beijing to India? Will there be any case or logic behind this moving semiconductor from Taiwan to some other destination?
Yeah, there is. In fact, diversification is always a smart move, and Taiwanese companies themselves are diversifying. And there is quite a bit of semiconductor manufacturing in these other countries. Taiwan and South Korea really specialize in different types of chips, but there is a lot of this. I think the issue right now is the U.S. policy and the U.S. strategy right now is not one of diversification. It's one of onshoring to the U.S. And currently it's one of using the threat of tariffs to try to force semiconductors to be made here in the U.S. as opposed to any other countries. It's not just Taiwan.
And just narrowing our topics, come back to the cross-strait relations between Beijing and Taipei. How do you think that China's leaders fundamentally view the Taiwan issue today?
I think they view it as a huge risk. No Chinese leader can afford to mess up the Taiwan issue. So I guess we have to remember what really drives China's leaders is the need to stay in power. There have been so many propaganda narratives around Taiwan. They've made this a really emotional issue that's tied up in the legitimacy of their government. So while there's no pressure for them to resolve the Taiwan issue right now, there is immense pressure for them not to lose their claim over Taiwan. There are two ways they could really lose this claim. One would be by failing to prevent Taiwan independence, but the other would be to try to use force to exert control over Taiwan and to fail at it. So they're really not sure they can take Taiwan by force. This isn't just a military, people say all the time, well, maybe the military knows how hard it would be, but does Xi know? I think Xi is petrified of the Taiwan issue, like all of his predecessors were. And, even a successful war over Taiwan would come at such a huge cost, economically, physically, so many deaths, so much destruction. It would really throw away all that China has accomplished under Xi and under his predecessors. So I don't think they see this as something that they're in a hurry to resolve. And I think they see it as time very much being on their side. If they can stay out of a major conflict, the U.S. will manage to lose its supremacy, and they will manage to surpass the U.S. To a point that there won't really be any major conflict. I think that's how they see it.
And there is another point about 2027 predictions. Do you think that this timeline is meaningful, or is it just being overstated by experts or observers?
Yeah, it's meaningful, but it's being overstated. It's meaningful for reasons that are not what everyone's talking about. It's meaningful because it's the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the PLA. It's also a milestone for the long-term development of China's military. So they have various milestones. 2027 is one of them, 2035, 2049 are others. So what's going to happen in 2027? A huge military parade to mark the 100-year anniversary of the People's Liberation Army. That's what's going to happen. Now, the U.S. intelligence community says she explicitly ordered the military to be ready for an invasion or for military conflict over Taiwan by 2027. I don't know where that came from. They could be privy to intel that I don't have, and I'm open to the possibility that that Taiwan was explicitly mentioned in that. That would be not in character of how she usually speaks or how China's leaders usually treat this issue. But I'm open to the possibility because the intelligence community says it happened. But my hunch is that they were reading between the lines and that they were saying, well, we know that what they're developing their military for is a Taiwan contingency. And so if he wants them to, be at a certain level of readiness by 2027, it must be about Taiwan. Regardless, even the intel community statement, doesn't say that he told them to attack Taiwan in 2027. He said that, or they said that he said be ready, and that no decision has been made. In fact, the U.S. government and intel community have been very clear that they don't believe she has made any decision on when or if to go after Taiwan. Now, the other reason 2027 is so significant, and the reason why it's probably the least likely year for China to do anything using force over Taiwan or any other significant issue, is because its next party Congress is happening in 2027. So, they are extremely conservative and cautious. They don't want anything to happen that could make, especially Xi, he's bidding for another term in office and he's going to get it, but he doesn't want to do anything. They do not take any chances. He doesn't want to do anything that's going to throw in question his leadership. Getting involved in a major war, that would really question his judgment, or would at least leave that possibility. So we saw how hard it was for China to leave their failing zero COVID policy leading up to the last party Congress, where it was literally crumbling before their eyes and they couldn't get out of it until after the party Congress. And it's for the same reason. The incentive structure is for everyone to just, don't rock the boat, don't do anything major until after the party Congress, after our positions are secure. And I would point out that right after the party Congress, a lot of government officials are lame ducks until the next National People's Congress session, which would be in March of the following year. And so, a significant year, but not a year for China to attack Taiwan.
From here, what kind of the internal movement or internal happenings can trigger Xi to attack Taiwan? And just let me merge with my next questions. And to what extent does Xi view unification as part of his personal or historical legacy?
Yeah. So from the perspective of China's leadership, they will not hesitate to take military action or any kind of decisive action to try to resolve the Taiwan issue, if they assess, this is their assessment, not my assessment or anyone else's assessment, they would have to assess that the risk of not doing so would exceed the risk of doing so. And that's, the political risk to their main interest of staying in power. And that's just the stark political reality of China's political system. And so that's what it would take. So probably a Taiwan declaration of independence, almost constitutionally almost impossible for any government in Taiwan to do, but that would almost certainly trigger it. But they would still, they would still judge whether the risk of not acting, whether that really is higher than the risk of acting, and they would probably judge that it is, that to preserve their legacy, their legitimacy, they have to go in. But other than that, I mentioned U.S. Establishment of diplomatic relations with Taiwan or a security alliance. That would probably, based on their white papers on Taiwan, it seems that would probably cross the red line, but there's a little ambiguity there. Now, as far as, does Xi view unification of Taiwan as part of his personal legacy? He could. I don't know if that's the case. I've seen no indication that it is, to be honest. I'm sure he would love to, but the only thing he has laid out that resembles a deadline, and they don't, for really good reasons, they don't set deadlines for Taiwan. So he could have something in his mind that none of us know about. But the only thing resembling a deadline that's been floated by Xi is 2049. There are questions in Taiwan whether that really is a timeline, or in China, whether that really is a timeline. But assuming it is, he'll be 96 then. I don't know if he plans on still being in power when he's 96, maybe, but that's a huge gamble. We don't even know if he'll still be with us when he's 96. So, it's possible that, like all of his predecessors, he's really kicking the issue to his successors. But he certainly, I think we can say that his legacy depends on him not being the one who lost Taiwan. And I think he does want to be able to show that he's made clear progress on unification. But it's really quite easy to claim progress when you control the propaganda narratives. And so I don't think he has any burning need to resolve the Taiwan issue. What his legacy is, from everything I can see, his legacy is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So, it was written in his resolution on history a couple years ago. Under Mao, China stood up. Under Deng, China became rich. And under Xi, China became strong. That is his legacy. And so once again, a major war over Taiwan would really throw away a lot of this and leave China in a much worse position. So I would be surprised if it seems to be, you can have one or the other, the Great Rejuvenation or Taiwan, unless you wait until the Great Rejuvenation is accomplished mid-century and then, hope that Taiwan falls into your hands.
And given recent meeting between President Trump and Xi Jinping, there is a semiconductor and tariffs and trade, so many topics on the table. So how might China's strategy change if U.S. support for Taiwan were significantly reduced?
Well, it would still be extremely risky for China to attack Taiwan, but it would be much easier for China to achieve peaceful unification. Now, what do I mean by this? I really believe peaceful unification is probably the only serious option China has. Any kind of military option or even a Hail Mary gray zone, like let's just cripple Taiwan's economy and politics through cyber attacks, this type of stuff. Anything you do to try to resolve the issue quickly, you have to be ready and willing to resort to a full-on invasion, because none of this will work. Talk about a blockade. It's not going to work unless you really do enforce it. And that seriously increases the likelihood that the US, Japan, Taiwan itself, and other countries are going to act with military force, and that you end up in that conflict. And so really the only thing is peaceful unification. That doesn't mean willing unification. It doesn't mean they've converted, that they've proselytized the Taiwanese people and converted them to the greatness of communism or anything like that. It means, keep gray zone activity under the threshold where Taiwan, the US, and everyone else will not act meaningfully to stop them because they don't want to escalate it too far. Wear down Taiwan's government credibility, the will of Taiwan's people to fight, divide Taiwan's society, convince America that war is basically inevitable and it's best to just sit it out. And then, and this is where your question, the answer to your question is, then you basically they can compel Taiwan to come to the bargaining table and say, look, you talk with us now, you at least have some say in what one country, two systems looks like. Don't make us use force. You have no say then. And frankly, I think that makes a pretty compelling case at that point. So I do think it would be game changing if the US ever decided that, Taiwan is not our problem.
And just let me ask my last questions about, given the recent developments between Japan and the Japan's also fortification of island just next to the Taiwan, like Guni Island and other islands. I will ask another questions about the Kinmen and Matsu Islands. What is their importance in Beijing's strategy and their importance in Taiwan's independence?
Yeah, this is actually a fascinating question. And I would say they're extremely important, but for ways that I think most people don't quite pay attention to. So I have heard, many people say that one of Beijing's options, and maybe a more likely option than taking over Taiwan, would just be to seize the offshore islands. I have to say that's the last thing I worry about. And the reason for this is that, first, the offshore islands are not China's goal. China's goal is Taiwan. The offshore islands basically are they're very friendly to China anyway, Kinmen and Matsu.
It's possible to say it will be, if in case of Taiwan invasion or successfully incorporating to mainland, it will be next step to at least make some platform toward first island chains and dealing with Japan.
Yeah, so if they were to take over these islands until they're ready to go after Taiwan proper, that if they ever do, I will be worried that the full-on invasion is happening, because you don't want to be caught in the crossfire, with Taiwanese forces both on the offshore islands and on Taiwan. And so at that point, if they're taking them over, I think it's a clear sign that the invasion is coming. But the importance, this actually goes straight back to the Taiwan independence issue. What most people don't understand is what Taiwan independence means. And it doesn't mean the Taiwanese president saying we are not subordinate to China. It means changing the constitution either to declare the founding of a Republic of Taiwan, so independence from the Republic of China, Taiwan's official name, or it would mean changing the boundaries of the Republic of China to say we are only Taiwan. And so as long as these offshore islands, which are part of Fujian province, the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China both have Fujian province, as long as those belong to Taiwan, Taiwan is still tied to the Republic of China. It's still tied to one China. It still cannot really get rid of its own one China policy, which is that it is the government of China, as long as it still has jurisdiction over parts of China, it is very hard for them to break Taiwan off and say, well, we're just, our own country now. And that's really what, it's very nuanced, but that's really what Taiwan independence would entail. And so from Beijing's perspective, they know this very well. And they want those offshore islands, not only is it this, that they want Taiwan to be linked to China or Republic of China, but linked to China. But also, I mean, these are just reliable jurisdictions that consistently vote KMT, play a really important role in cross-strait relations, cross-strait cooperation. And so it's very much in China's interest for them to stay that way. But as I said, if China ever does seize the offshore islands, I would take that as an indication that it's going full force after Taiwan.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now, I think there is a few interesting questions come from my audience. Just let me bring on the screen.
Okay.
What will be your response, Eric Sofield? Can you read? Did you see the question?
Yeah,
it
says there's growing talk of a governance crisis in Taiwan. How do this governance challenges in Taiwan affect its ability to manage security threats, and what risks arise if these issues remain unresolved? Well, this really goes back to what I was saying about or maybe I didn't say it explicitly. So thanks for this question. To the extent that that Taiwan cannot be unified, it very much does face a heightened threat. I do not believe that the Chinese leadership thinks that it can go in and take Taiwan at a cost that it can accept. So I do think that its play is to degrade Taiwan's will to fight and America's will to support Taiwan. So the governance issues and the infighting between the KMT and DPP right now, really what that does is, and I would point out that I don't blame any one side more than the other in this infighting. But what it does is not only does it really amplify narratives in Taiwan that, oh, our government isn't serious, our government isn't capable of support of defending us. It degrades the will to fight in that way, but it also sends Washington a message, which is that, look, they don't care and they're not serious. And so those are really two of the things I worry about the most with regards to Taiwan.
Okay, just there is next one. Gabriela Marcusa. White House announced an 11.1 billion ounce package beyond the price tag. Does include ATACMS signal a shift in U.S. policy from coastal defense to providing the Taiwan with the deep strike capabilities. And really, thanks, Gabriela. This just happened yesterday. I didn't find time to include my interview question. This is a very significant development.
Yeah, this looks like a very significant development to me. What I would say, though, is that I am not a defense analyst, so I do not know the various military systems like many of my colleagues in DC do. I would really defer to them. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot written about this issue. What I can say this means is it shows pretty definitively that, sure, Trump may be, talking a really pretty talk with Xi, but he's not an idiot, and he understands he understands geopolitics, and he understands the importance of Taiwan. I know, there have been things said he said things on every side of the argument, and he has people around him who believe basically every version of the narratives about Taiwan. But I think his instinct is, not only to support Taiwan, but to support it in a big way. And I think that's what we saw. I think we do have to remember, and I'm definitely not sort of a Trump apologist in any way, but we do have to remember that there was a massive amount of record amounts of numbers of weapons sales to Taiwan under Trump's first presidency, and now we're seeing the biggest package ever, and I think that is very significant.
Just last two questions. This from Malin. Recently, Emmanuel Macron visited Beijing and received a noticeably warm welcome from China than many other EU leaders. What explains China's special relationship with France or with Macron in particular? Do you have any comment about, Michael?
I really can't say. This is a very interesting observation. I actually haven't thought about that. In particular, I would say that that China is very much trying to drive a wedge between the U.S. and or maybe Trump is driving a wedge between the U.S. and Europe, and China is trying to capitalize on that. I don't know if it's something about the personal chemistry of the two leaders or something about Macron himself. I mean, he's been in power for quite some time.
There is an important point. The Malin, who asked the question, just tried the line between. She compared the EU leaders and Macron.
Yeah, and yeah, I find that interesting, but I don't know. I also don't know how to definitively prove that Macron got a significantly better. We don't know what happens behind closed doors in the negotiations either.
Michael, last time when Emmanuel Macron visited Beijing, there is also another great welcome for Macron in Beijing. Is it, or would it be accurate to say Beijing and the France interests overlap after the AUKUS agreement, which France excluded and replaced it by United States with the United Kingdom? Is it possible to make a link?
Yeah,
or the France, Paris, and Beijing's links more historical, more deepened than we think.
Yeah, I would caution against trying to link it to one thing or another, to one specific thing. I guess I would defer to a Europe expert and try to see, someone who specifically focuses on China-Europe ties. I mean, it's an interesting point. I don't know if it's substantively significant or if it's but it is very interesting point.
Okay, just let me bring my last audience question from Hasun Kim. How do the internal political pressure within the CCP shape Beijing's behavior toward Taiwan, and how might these domestic dynamics matter more than assessments of military readiness in the years ahead? You actually touch upon some part of this.
Yeah.
If you have some short comments.
Yeah, I touched on that, and I really appreciate the question and how it's framed, because the domestic political pressures in China absolutely influence China's decision-making far more than military readiness. Multiple studies have shown that, most recently by Taylor Fravel, who wrote a really nice piece in Foreign Affairs a few months ago. But multiple studies have shown that China has never, at least since the PRC has existed, has never made a decision to use force based on military readiness. It was not ready for the Korean War, for example. it had been it was just getting off of a civil war, and it's never made these decisions based on anyone's assessment of its military readiness. In Taiwan, we have seen its approach fluctuate quite a bit. And, if you look at the Chen Shui-bian era, when Chen Shui-bian was president of Taiwan, and the military balance between China and Taiwan favored Taiwan. And yet Taiwan was very belligerent. And according to some reports, really came close to going to war. Whereas in the Ma Ying-jeou era, when the balance had already shifted in Beijing's favor, the relationship was so good that Beijing didn't, really was quite calm with regards to Taiwan. In fact, Xi himself, who is often presented as the person who changed everything about Taiwan-China dynamics, Xi himself went and met with President Ma and shook hands with him. And so, we can't really say that it's military readiness, that, China's military is more capable now and therefore it's acting in certain ways. There are other things happening. And the biggest driver very much is China's domestic politics. And it's primarily the fear of messing up the issue, essentially. It's the fear of losing power. Chinese politics is a really raucous, behind closed doors, everyone wants the same jobs. Everyone is competing for elevation in the party system. And when you get up to the top like Xi, you're paranoid of falling from power. And if Xi fell from power, it would be devastating for him. He's basically ruined. He's ruined so many capable officials' careers. So many people rotting in jail due to his anti-corruption campaigns. And so, this is the main driver, is sort of the fear of political risk to the leadership of China. So if the time comes, as I think I mentioned before, if the day comes that the leadership determines that, man, for whatever reason, we have to act now, or else our political interests, our political survival is going to suffer, or the regime's political survival, either one of those would be significant enough, either Xi's or the regime's. If that happens, that's the day that they decide they have to go in. And the only way I can see that happening is if the true red line is crossed. It could also happen if propaganda narrative, or if the public demanded immediate action on Taiwan. But I do not see that as being very possible because Xi himself controls the propaganda narratives. Beijing controls, but the CCP controls the propaganda narratives. Even if someone wanted to discredit Xi, they'd be hard pressed to do that, given his control of the most important, most of the party organizations that matter, including the propaganda. But even if that was driving a change in propaganda, I highly doubt they would do that over Taiwan and force Xi's hand with regards to Taiwan, because that is potentially catastrophic, not just for Xi himself, but for the regime.
And thank you very much, Michael. I just come to the end of my question, and I ask my audience questions. Your insight is really important and significant. You shared with my audiences. You spent a lot of time in Asia and China. It is a really great opportunity to listen your remarks and answers about this important topic. And thank you for joining me again.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
You're welcome. And also thank you for my audiences who spent time until the end of show with us. Please don't forget to subscribe to channel and hit the notification bell for our next upcoming live interview. Thank you very much. See you on the next episode.